The streets were quiet, just the occasional sound of distant traffic humming in the background. It was the kind of night when nothing seemed out of the ordinary until Officer Bradley spotted him. A young black man, well-dressed, walking with purpose, a briefcase gripped firmly in his hand. Something about him caught the officer's attention, though he couldn't quite say why. Maybe it was the confidence in his stride, the calm look on his face, or the way he didn't even glance at the squad car parked down the block. Officer Bradley had been on the force for years, patrolling the same streets, dealing with the same faces. He liked to think he had a sixth sense for trouble, and tonight, something about this guy felt off. Not in an obvious way. There was no nervous fidgeting, no darting eyes, but still, a gut feeling told him to take a closer look. Without much thought, he flicked on his patrol lights and slowly rolled forward. The man, mid-20s, maybe younger, paused for a moment, as if weighing his options before stepping to the side of the sidewalk. He didn't run, didn't act surprised, just watched as the officer approached, his face calm, unreadable. "Evening," Officer Bradley said, keeping his voice steady but firm. "Where you headed?" The man looked him over, then exhaled softly. "Just heading home," he replied, his tone polite but not overly friendly. Officer Bradley nodded, his gaze shifting to the briefcase. "What's in the case?" The man's fingers tensed slightly around the handle, but his face remained neutral. "Personal belongings." That was it. No extra details, no explanations. It wasn't illegal to carry a briefcase at night, of course, but something about his reluctance piqued the officer's curiosity. Maybe it was the way he held it, tight, protective. Bradley had seen that look before. People guarded what they didn't want found. "Mind opening it up for me?" The man's expression didn't change, but there was a pause before he answered. "I'd rather not. It's private." And there it was, that subtle shift, the quiet resistance that made Officer Bradley's instincts flare. Most people, even when annoyed by police questioning, would sigh and comply just to get it over with. But this man, he wasn't scared, wasn't defensive, just refusing. Bradley glanced around. No witnesses nearby, just the dim glow of a street lamp casting long shadows over the pavement. His radio was silent, no urgent calls pulling him away. He had time. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to open the briefcase," he said, firmer this time. The young man didn't move. His eyes met Bradley's, steady and unwavering. "Am I being detained?" That simple question sent a flicker of annoyance through Bradley. He'd dealt with these types before, people who knew their rights, who thought they could outsmart the system. He could push it, demand compliance, but something in the air felt different tonight. Still, his curiosity got the best of him. Before the man could protest further, Bradley reached out and unlatched the briefcase himself. It clicked open with a quiet snap, revealing a stack of neatly arranged documents inside. No cash, no weapons, nothing illegal, just paper. But as Bradley's eyes scanned the first page, his breath caught in his throat. His face, just moments ago set in the hardened confidence of authority, drained of color. The documents weren't random. They were legal papers, signed statements, copies of emails, official seals from high-ranking officers. And right there, in bold print at the top of one of the pages, was his own name. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages, his pulse pounding in his ears. The words jumped out at him. Misconduct, falsified reports, internal investigations. It wasn't just him. There were other names, officers he knew, supervisors he reported to. This wasn't just some random paperwork. This was evidence. Evidence that could ruin careers. Evidence that could end his. The young man watched him carefully, the faintest hint of something in his eyes. Not fear, not anger. Just certainty. As if he had known exactly how this would play out. Bradley swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how silent the street had become, how exposed he felt standing there, holding what could be his undoing. His mind raced. He had a choice, several, in fact, but none of them felt safe. And the young man, still standing there, briefcase now open between them, simply waited. Because he already knew this night was far from over. Officer Bradley could hear his own breathing, steady but shallow, as his grip on the papers tightened. His eyes darted over the words again, hoping he had misread, but the truth was right there in front of him. These documents weren't just accusations, they were airtight, detailed, impossible to dismiss. Whoever had put this together knew exactly what they were doing. And the young man, he wasn't just some random guy on the street. Bradley looked up slowly, suddenly seeing him in a different light. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't waiting for an explanation or pleading for his belongings back. He was calm, controlled, watching Bradley the way someone watches a chessboard, already several moves ahead. "Where'd you get these?" Bradley asked, his voice lower now, controlled but strained. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied Bradley, as if measuring his reaction. Then, with a small sigh, he said, "You already know." The words sent a chill through Bradley's spine, because he did know. The department had been whispering about something like this for months. Internal affairs poking around, names getting thrown in the air, rumors spreading like wildfire. Officers with long histories suddenly resigning overnight. Others being reassigned out of nowhere. Bradley hadn't thought much of it. He had done what most of his colleagues did, kept his head down and minded his own business. But now, looking at the papers, seeing his own name woven into the mess, he realized he should have paid closer attention. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "You're making a mistake." The man gave a small, almost amused shake of his head. "No," he said simply, "you did." Bradley's grip on the papers tightened, his mind racing through his options. He could confiscate them, say they were evidence, bring them in and bury them before anyone else saw. He could threaten the guy, pressure him into silence, make it clear that if these documents ever saw the light of day, things wouldn't end well for him. But something in the man's face told him it wouldn't work. He wasn't scared. He wasn't some naive kid who had stumbled into something bigger than himself. He knew exactly what he was doing. Bradley took a step back, glancing around. The street was still empty, but for the first time in his career, he didn't feel like he had control. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice lower now. The man exhaled slowly, as if debating how much to say. Then, after a beat, he answered, "Someone who's tired of watching people like you get away with everything." Bradley felt his stomach drop. The words hit harder than they should have. "People like you." He wanted to argue, to push back, to tell the guy he didn't know what he was talking about. But did he? Bradley wasn't a bad cop, at least not in his own mind. He had never done anything extreme, never been reckless or cruel. But he had looked the other way. He had stayed quiet when he should have spoken up. He had let things slide, convinced himself that it wasn't his problem, that it wasn't worth losing his job over. And now it had all caught up with him. "I should take you in," he said, the words feeling weak even as they left his mouth. The man raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Bradley opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. No crime, no cause. If anything, he was the one who had just done something illegal by opening that briefcase without a warrant. The man took a slow step forward, just enough to close the distance between them. "You're at a crossroads, officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You can try to shut this down, pretend like you can make it all go away. Or—" he let the word hang in the air, letting Bradley fill in the rest. "Or he could do something different." Bradley wanted to scoff at the idea. He wasn't the kind of man who flipped on his own people. That wasn't how things worked. The system protected its own. That was the unspoken rule, the one thing you could always count on. But looking at those papers, reading his own name, seeing the proof laid out in black and white, he wasn't sure if the system was protecting him anymore. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, but he didn't wipe it away. His pulse was still pounding, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "What do you want?" he asked finally. The young man studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached forward and took back his briefcase, snapping it shut with a quiet finality. "I want you to think about the choice you're about to make," he said. "Because whatever you do next, you're going to have to live with it." Bradley stared at him, feeling something twist in his chest. The man turned and started walking away, his footsteps light, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Bradley didn't stop him. He just stood there watching, the weight of his own past pressing down on him like never before. Bradley stood frozen as the young man disappeared down the dimly lit street, the briefcase now clutched securely in his grip. He should have stopped him, should have demanded answers, but his body wouldn't move. His hands still trembled slightly from what he had just read. His own name, printed in black ink, alongside accusations that could end his career in an instant. He had always thought he was careful, had always told himself he was just doing his job. But now, as he stood under the flickering glow of the street lamp, reality crashed into him like a wave. He needed to think. Turning on his heel, he strode back to his patrol car and slammed the door shut. The radio crackled with static, another officer somewhere in the city responding to a minor disturbance. Bradley barely heard it. His thoughts were a tangled mess. Who was that guy? And how had he gotten those documents? He hadn't recognized him, but the way the young man spoke, the certainty in his voice, told him this wasn't some random citizen stumbling into something dangerous. He knew exactly what he was doing, and that briefcase wasn't just filled with paperwork. It was leverage. Bradley swallowed hard, rubbing a hand over his face. He couldn't ignore this. If those files got into the wrong hands, or the right hands, depending on how you looked at it, his entire department could come crashing down, and him along with it. He needed to find out how deep this went. Flipping open his laptop, he typed quickly, searching internal records for anything that might give him a lead. There had been rumors about an internal investigation, but no official reports had ever surfaced. That wasn't surprising. These things rarely made it out in the open. But now, looking at the evidence that had just been in his hands, he knew for certain someone had been digging. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Should he log this incident? Report the encounter? If he did, it would only raise more questions. His stomach twisted. What if they already knew? What if this wasn't just about a few bad cops getting caught? What if the department was compromised all the way to the top? A slow realization crept in. If those documents existed, that meant someone had been collecting them. Someone with access. Someone who had been watching. And that meant whoever had put this together had planned for tonight. The thought sent a chill through him. Bradley reached for his phone, his fingers dialing a number before he could second-guess himself. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah, it's me," Bradley said quietly. "We have a problem." There was a pause, a long one. Then, "Where are you?" Bradley hesitated. He shouldn't be making this call, but he had already crossed the line when he opened that briefcase. Now, there was no going back. "I need to talk, in person." Another pause. Then finally, same place as last time. 20 minutes. The call ended. Bradley exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel. His contact was an old friend in the department, someone who had been around long enough to know how things really worked. If anyone could help him figure this out, it was him. But as Bradley pulled away from the curb, the weight in his chest didn't ease, because something told him this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. Somewhere across town, the young man with the briefcase walked briskly down an alley, his mind sharp, focused. He had expected resistance. He had expected questions. But what he hadn't expected was the flicker of doubt in the officer's eyes. Bradley wasn't like the others. That wasn't to say he was innocent, far from it. But there had been something in his face tonight, not just fear. Realization. The young man had seen it before. He knew the look of someone who was suddenly aware they were standing on a crumbling foundation. It didn't mean Bradley could be trusted, but it did mean he wasn't completely unreachable. That could be useful. He turned a corner, stepping into the shadows where another figure was waiting. "You were right," the young man said quietly. He'd opened it. The other figure, slightly older, nodded. "And he didn't try to arrest me, didn't even try to take it back." The older man exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "That means he's thinking. Or panicking." "Same thing," the older man murmured. They stood in silence for a moment. The night was cool, the city alive in the distance, but here, in the narrow alleyway, everything felt still. "What now?" the younger one asked. The older man's eyes darkened. "Now, we wait." Bradley pulled into a nearly deserted parking lot behind an old warehouse, cutting the engine, but leaving the headlights on. His contact's car was already there, a dark sedan that had seen better days. The man leaned against the hood, arms crossed, eyes unreadable as Bradley approached. "You look like hell," the man muttered. Bradley ignored the comment. "I need to know who's behind this." The man studied him for a moment before speaking. "You sure you want that answer?" Bradley clenched his jaw. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." A slow nod. Then, after a pause, the man pulled a small folder from his coat and handed it over. "This is what I've got so far." Bradley opened it, his eyes scanning quickly. Photos, reports, internal memos, all names he recognized, some higher up than he expected. And at the bottom, a single note scrawled in quick handwriting. Asterisk, asterisk, watch your back, asterisk, asterisk. His throat tightened. "This isn't just about you," the man said quietly. "This is bigger than that. And if you think they don't already know you were poking around tonight, you're wrong." Bradley exhaled, gripping the folder. "How much time do I have?" The man gave a humorless chuckle. "Depends on what you do next." Bradley looked up, his mind racing. He had spent years convincing himself he was just doing his job, but the things he ignored weren't his problem. But now, standing in the glow of his headlights, holding the evidence in his hands, he realized the truth. It had always been his problem. And now there was no escaping it. Bradley sat in his car, gripping the folder so tightly that the edges of the paper curled under his fingers. His pulse was steady, but his mind was anything but. He had always known there were lines in this job, lines that some people crossed without hesitation and others, like him, tried to stay on the right side of. But looking at the names in this file, seeing just how deep the corruption went, he realized something terrifying. There was no right side. He had spent years thinking he was just doing his duty, turning a blind eye when necessary, picking his battles. But now, as he stared down at the evidence laid out in front of him, he understood that silence had never kept him safe. It had only made him complicit, and if he wasn't careful, it would make him a target. His contact shifted beside him, watching. "What's going through your head right now?" Bradley swallowed. "I'm trying to figure out how I get out of this alive." The older man let out a slow breath. "There's only one way." Bradley looked at him. "You either help them," the man continued, nodding toward the folder, "or you help us." Us. Bradley knew what that meant. It wasn't just this man sitting beside him. There were others, people inside the department, maybe even higher, working from the shadows. People who had been gathering information, putting the pieces together. People who had probably known about him long before tonight. "What do you know about the kid?" Bradley asked, his voice quieter now. The man smirked slightly. "Not a kid. He's smarter than you think." Bradley nodded, rubbing his jaw. That much was obvious. The way he had stood there, calm, unshaken, not even flinching when Bradley opened that briefcase. He hadn't come into this unprepared. "He's been working on this for a long time," the man continued. "Long before you ever showed up in that patrol car tonight. But you're the first one who had the choice." Bradley frowned. "What do you mean?" The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Most guys in your position wouldn't have thought twice. They would have arrested him. Maybe worse." A chill crawled up Bradley's spine. "That's not me." "Maybe not." The man sighed, folding his arms. But that doesn't mean they'll see it that way. If you hesitate too long, if they get the sense that you're not on their side anymore, well, you know how this goes. Bradley clenched his jaw. He did know. He had seen it happen before. Officers who got too curious, who started asking the wrong questions, who stopped playing along. They either transferred out quietly, disappeared into desk jobs in some other district, or, worse. He exhaled, staring out at the empty parking lot. Somewhere out there, the young man with the briefcase was waiting to see what Bradley would do. "I need more time," Bradley muttered. The man let out a dry laugh. "Time is the one thing you don't have." Bradley knew he was right. The second he had opened that briefcase, his name had been written down in a different way. He wasn't just another cop on patrol anymore, he was a loose end. And if there was one thing the department hated, it was loose ends. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and his stomach tightened. He didn't even have to check to know that someone had found out about his meeting tonight. Slowly, he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He let it ring. He wasn't ready to answer. The man beside him sighed. "That's them. You know that, right?" Bradley nodded, sliding the phone back into his pocket. "Yeah. They're going to want to know where you stand." Bradley ran a hand through his hair, his pulse picking up again. He needed to move. He needed a plan. But every option in front of him felt like a trap. If he tried to run, he'd never make it far enough. If he tried to play both sides, they'd figure it out sooner or later. And if he did nothing, he didn't even want to think about what would happen then. He turned back to the man beside him. "What would you do?" The man studied him for a long moment before answering. "I'd pick a side." Bradley exhaled, gripping the wheel. The choice was coming, whether he was ready or not. And once he made it, there was no going back. Bradley sat in the silence of his car, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a vice. The headlights still cut through the darkness, illuminating the near-empty lot, but the world beyond them felt like a storm waiting to break. He could feel it coming, the shift, the moment when everything would tip past the point of no return, and it was coming fast. His phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time, he knew he couldn't ignore it. He let out a slow breath and pressed the answer button. "Bradley," a voice on the other end said, calm but firm. "You've had quite a night." His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Who is this?" A chuckle. "You already know the answer to that." His pulse picked up. The voice wasn't one he recognized, but the tone, the certainty, it belonged to someone who was used to being in control, someone who had power. "You made a mistake tonight," the voice continued, "but it's not too late to fix it." Bradley swallowed. "What do you want?" A pause. Then, "You have something that doesn't belong to you." The briefcase. Bradley's mind raced. He didn't have it anymore. The young man had taken it back. But the fact that they thought he did meant one thing. They didn't know everything. Not yet. "You went looking in places you shouldn't have," the voice continued. "That's a dangerous habit." Bradley clenched his jaw. "If you're trying to scare me." "I don't have to." The voice cut him off. "Because you already know what happens next." A cold realization settled in his chest. This wasn't a warning. It was a decision being made for him. "You're going to bring it to us," the voice said. "And in return, we forget tonight ever happened." Bradley stayed silent, his mind working through the angles. They thought he still had the briefcase. They thought he was the problem. Which meant the young man was still off their radar. For now. He had a split second to respond, to decide how to play this. If he hesitated too long, they'd know something was off. But if he agreed too quickly, they'd expect results. His throat felt dry. "Where?" The voice on the line was quiet for a moment, as if measuring his response. Then finally, "Old factory on East Ridge." "You know the one." Bradley did. It was a place people went when they didn't want to be seen. A place where problems got handled. The voice continued, steady and final. "Midnight. Don't be late." The line went dead. Bradley exhaled, his hands gripping the wheel as he stared out at the night. He was out of time. The man beside him let out a low whistle. Well, that escalated quickly. Bradley turned to him. "They think I still have it." The man nodded, already putting the pieces together. "That buys us time." Bradley shook his head. "Not much. If I don't show up with that briefcase, I'm done." The man studied him for a moment, then said, "So we make sure you don't show up alone." Bradley frowned. "You have people." A small smirk. "More than you think." Bradley ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He had spent years believing he understood the game, believing he knew the rules. But tonight, every rule had been rewritten. And now the only thing left to do was survive it. Across the city, the young man with the briefcase sat in a dimly lit room, his fingers tracing the edge of the worn leather. He had expected things to move fast, but even he hadn't predicted just how quickly the walls would start closing in. A knock at the door made him tense. He moved carefully, setting the briefcase aside as he reached for the small bag he had stashed under the table. His instincts had kept him alive this long, and they told him that knock wasn't good news. He opened the door just enough to see who was standing there. A woman, mid-30s, sharp eyes, the kind of presence that demanded attention without needing to say a word. "You should sit down," she said. He didn't move. "Who are you?" She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "I'm the person who just made sure you weren't found first." That got his attention. He stepped back, letting her in. She moved quickly, shutting the door behind her. "They're looking for you," she said, keeping her voice low. "But they think your friend still has it." Bradley. The young man clenched his fists. He had been careful, had planned every step. But the second Bradley had opened that briefcase, everything had changed. The woman studied him. "You were counting on him to be different, weren't you?" He didn't answer. She sighed. "Doesn't matter. What matters is what happens next." He looked at her. "And what is that?" She hesitated, then said, "They won't stop until they get it back. And they don't care how many bodies it takes." The words sat heavy in the air. For the first time tonight, the young man felt something shift inside him. He had started this mission for one reason, to expose the truth, to make sure justice was served. But now, the stakes were higher than he had planned for. Now, it wasn't just about the truth. It was about who made it out alive. The wind howled through the abandoned factory lot on East Ridge, rattling loose metal sheets and carrying the distant hum of the city. Bradley pulled his car to a stop just outside the rusted entrance, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Midnight was minutes away, and he could feel the weight of unseen eyes already tracking his every move. He wasn't alone. A shadow shifted near the far wall, then another. They were here, waiting, expecting him to walk in with the briefcase. But he had nothing to give them. He took a slow breath, his heartbeat steady but his instincts on high alert. He wasn't stupid. He knew how these meetings worked. If they suspected even for a second that he had lied, that he had nothing to bargain with, this wouldn't end with a handshake. He opened the car door and stepped out. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the entrance, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. He wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't dying here tonight. Inside the factory, dim industrial lights flickered along the high beams. The smell of rust and oil clung to the air. At the center of the vast open space, a group of men stood in a loose semicircle, their presence radiating control. The one in the middle, the one Bradley assumed had been the voice on the phone, smiled faintly as he stepped forward. "You're late," the man said. Bradley shrugged. "Traffic." The man let out a low chuckle, but there was no real amusement in it. His eyes drifted past Bradley, toward his car, as if expecting someone else to step out. "Where is it?" Bradley kept his face neutral. "That's the thing," he said slowly. "I don't have it." A flicker of something passed over the man's face, but he recovered quickly. He turned to the others around him, giving a small nod. They shifted, surrounding Bradley in a quiet but deliberate movement. "That's unfortunate," the man said. "You see, we don't like wasting time. And right now, it feels like you're wasting ours." Bradley exhaled slowly. "I didn't come here to play games. I came here to talk." The man smirked. "You think you have leverage?" Bradley tilted his head. "I think you wouldn't have asked me to come here if you had everything you needed." The man's expression darkened, but before he could respond, a sudden noise echoed through the factory, a distant clatter, like metal hitting concrete. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but in the charged silence of the room, it was enough. Bradley didn't move. He didn't have to. He already knew what was happening. The man's eyes flickered toward the shadows along the far wall, his instincts sharpening. "What was that?" he asked, turning slightly. That was all the distraction Bradley needed. Before anyone could react, the factory lights flickered once, then cut out entirely, plunging the space into darkness. The shift was immediate, voices rising in alarm, the scuffle of movement as the men tried to reposition themselves. But Bradley didn't wait. He moved fast, ducking low, and pushing toward the nearest cover just as the first shot rang out. Chaos exploded around him. Footsteps pounded against the concrete as shouts filled the air. Bradley didn't fire. He didn't need to. He knew exactly who had cut the lights. The young man with the briefcase had never planned to sit this one out. Bradley reached for his radio, his voice low but firm. "Move now." Within seconds, another presence entered the fray, silent, efficient. The older man from before. Bradley could hear him moving through the dark, taking advantage of the confusion. Another shot rang out, then a cry of pain. One of the men had gone down. The leader, still disoriented, snarled in frustration. "Find him." But before his men could react, the factory lights flickered back on, revealing a new reality. Half of his men were already down, disarmed, restrained, or too injured to fight back. The young man with the briefcase stood near the far exit, his gaze steady, his confidence unshaken. Beside him, the woman from earlier, calm, unreadable. She had been the wild card, the unseen player in this game. Bradley stepped forward, his gun still drawn. "It's over." The leader turned to him, seething. "You think this changes anything?" Bradley met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "No," he admitted, "but this does." The young man held up a small device, a recording, the red light still blinking. He pressed a button, and the factory filled with the voice from the earlier phone call. Asterisk, asterisk, he went looking in places you shouldn't have. That's a dangerous habit, asterisk, asterisk. The leader's face paled as the weight of the evidence settled over him. Bradley took another step closer. "You made a mistake tonight," he said, echoing the words the man had spoken to him earlier. "But it's not too late to fix it." For the first time, the leader looked uncertain. He had lost control, and he knew it. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Bradley didn't look away. "You have two choices," he continued. "You run, and we make sure every piece of evidence lands in the right hands. Or you stay, and we let them decide what happens next." The leader clenched his jaw, his eyes darting between Bradley and the young man. But he knew there was no way out. The moment stretched, tense and heavy. Then, finally, he exhaled and let the gun in his hand drop to the floor. Bradley nodded. Good choice. As officers swarmed the factory moments later, taking the men into custody, Bradley stepped aside, letting the weight of the night settle over him. The young man approached, his briefcase still in hand. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. Bradley let out a small breath. "Yeah," he muttered, "for once." The young man studied him. "You're not done, you know." Bradley glanced at him. "I figured." The young man smirked slightly. "Then I guess I'll be seeing you." He turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Bradley standing there as the chaos settled. Bradley watched him go, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He had spent years believing he knew how this world worked, believing that there were rules that couldn't be broken. Tonight had proved otherwise. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure where that left him. But he did know one thing. This wasn't over. Bradley stood outside the factory, the distant sound of sirens fading into the background. The chaos of the night was settling, but something inside him still felt restless, unfinished. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened, and he could feel the shift, the invisible line he had just crossed. He had spent years enforcing the law, believing in a system that was supposed to uphold justice. But tonight had shown him the cracks, the places where power could be twisted and manipulated. And now there was no going back. The young man was gone, disappearing into the night with a briefcase still clutched tightly in his hand. Bradley didn't stop him. He had done his part, played his role. What happened next was no longer in his hands. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You look like a man who just saw the world for what it really is." Bradley turned to see the older man, the one who had backed him up when everything started spiraling. He had been watching from a distance, letting Bradley handle things, but now he stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Bradley let out a small breath, shaking his head. "I don't even know what I just saw." The older man smirked. "Sure, you do. You just don't like what it means." Bradley was silent. He wasn't wrong. A few feet away, officers moved swiftly, securing the men they had arrested, their voices low and controlled. The leader of the group, the man who had tried to dictate the night's outcome, stood with his hands restrained behind his back, his expression tight. He hadn't said a word since he surrendered. There was nothing left for him to say. Bradley watched as they loaded him into the back of a patrol car, the red and blue lights casting long shadows against the factory walls. The system would take it from here, but for the first time, Bradley wasn't sure if that was enough. He turned back to the older man. "What happens now?" The man shrugged. "Depends. You could go back to your desk, pretend none of this happened." Bradley let out a bitter chuckle. "You know I can't do that." "Then you've got a choice to make," the man said simply. "You've seen how deep this goes. You know how easily things get buried. If you really want to fix something, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty." Bradley looked at him. "And that's what you do?" The man held his gaze, unreadable. "I do what needs to be done." Bradley wasn't sure what that meant, but he had a feeling he'd understand soon enough. The night air felt colder now, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving only exhaustion in its place. He ran a hand over his face, trying to shake the weight of it all. He had spent years believing the system worked, that if he followed the rules, justice would prevail. But tonight had shown him the truth. Justice wasn't about rules. It was about the people who were willing to fight for it. As he stood there, watching the last of the officers clear the scene, he realized something. He had spent his entire career thinking he was on the right side. But maybe the right side wasn't as clear-cut as he had always believed. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message. No name, just a number. ***, you're not done yet, ***. Bradley stared at the words for a long moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. He didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning.